Welcome to our unique class. Some of you who are accustomed to meeting with your own class have decided to suspend for the next 4 weeks to join us for a conversation about this book, The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And more on that in a minute. In case you're wondering what the basic premise of the book is, it's written right there on the first slide, which we'll use as something of a title slide. How we have overprotected our children in the real world and underprotected them in the virtual world is what the book is basically about. Glad to have you join us this morning and for the next 4 weeks. Obviously, the book has been a bestseller. It's caught on. Governor Sarah Huckabee Sanders read the book, sent it to all the other governors, state governors, and this was what was behind, we're told, her advocating for cell phone-free schools in the state of Arkansas over the next 3 years, which has been an interesting issue at BB High School, where my Rachel is a guidance counselor. This is Rachel Wisdom. You would remember her as Rachel Cox because she was here as a child in the youth group in 11th and 12th grade. We came to downtown when we moved back from Chicago in 1998. And so she was in the 11th and 12th grade, but she had the feeling that she had been part of the youth group for longer than that because it was so formative. She'll actually speak for herself on that. But she has been working in high school settings for a long time, 12 years at Soulsville Charter School in Memphis, which is a very urban setting where at least part of her time she was a teacher and the rest of her time she was a guidance counselor, kind of a college, what do you call that person that's the guidance counselor into college?
Just like a college counselor, real technical.
It's called a college counselor. It's the technical term. Thank you, Rachel. And she is now in her 4th year. There was this boy at BB High School that was chasing her. So she moved to BB to see if that might work out. It did work out. They were married almost 3 years ago, December. I was there. I remember it. And Jeff is in the room right there. He's taught at BB High School for 21 years. So, but Rachel is the guidance counselor there. She has a master's degree in education, and she's next month finishing her master's degree in school counseling. But you have dual licensure. It's not in school counseling.
I'm almost finished with dual licensure in school counseling and clinical mental health.
So the deal is she works with high school students, and then I get them when they come to college. Not that everyone from BB High School comes to Harding, but it's been an interesting thing to compare notes as she read the book before I did, then I read it this summer, and we both thought, wow, this is a profound book, so we need to talk about this because it's such a big deal. But we don't want to just rip on Gen Z, right?
So this book is a lot about Gen Z, but as we hopefully will talk about throughout this class series in the next 4 weeks, that this is obviously has a lot of implications for us too, and we'll have a chance to reflect on that. But this isn't Gen Z's fault, right? A lot of the stuff that we'll talk about, like our generations did this. We were the ones giving them the devices and not monitoring them appropriately, right? And we are just as impacted by the technology as our children are, and we see that in a lot of different ways. So we'll talk about that. But like he said, I got really interested in this topic because as any teacher will tell you, phones in school is a really big problem. In fact, we feel like so often we're the cell phone police, and we spend half of our day dealing with issues regarding cell phones. Even if it's not, they're using their cell phone in class, it's been incredible how the discipline incidents have come up just from things that are happening on the phones, right? And so we keep seeing these problems and not just cell phone problems, but in my work as a school counselor, so I do a lot of college and career, and I've noticed a serious trend of a lack of sort of resiliency skills or the ability to do some basic things when it comes to communication. Like if we have to make a follow-up call to a college, we have to rehearse sometimes before we make a phone call, and even then when the phone rings and the person answers, they look at me like, what do I say? What do I say? And I say, your name, right? Like it seems like we have some really basic skills that are missing because of this dependence on technology. And again, we see this in adults as well. And I know, my husband teaches AP Physics, which is not an easy subject, and he's been teaching it the same way for a long time. And we've never had this many kids complaining about how this is just too hard, right? And so it seems like there's so many little things that we don't think about that are coming from some of these issues with overdependence on technology. So I saw an article he wrote for The Atlantic, this researcher, and I was so blown away by how he was putting data and figures and smart words to things I'd been noticing in my own experience at school. And so I picked up this book and read it, and I've read it twice, actually. And then I also read his book, The Coddling of the American Mind, that he wrote. I don't know if you've ever heard of that. Also a great book with some overlap. So, yeah.
This is where we're going these 4 weeks. Today we'll be in the introduction through chapter 1. That's what it's called, right? Chapter 1. How many of you have actually read the book? Anybody read the Anxious Generation? That's quite a few of you, so you'll appreciate how difficult it is to take just 4 weeks on a really thick book. But today we're going to talk about the great rewiring of childhood, which is what he calls it, what happened when smartphones became so ubiquitous in our culture. Talk about the basic data. Next Sunday, Lord willing, we'll talk about free-range kids and the dangers of something called safetyism. Safetyism is a new word to me from reading this book, but it's a real thing, and we'll talk about it next week. Social media, girls, boys, wounded souls. He actually has a chapter. Jonathan Haidt is not a Christian person, not a person of faith, but he has a whole chapter on spiritual elevation and degradation that is a product of the ubiquity that, I'm looking for a better word than that, just the prevalence of smartphones in our culture. And not just among Gen Z, but among all of us. In fact, I dare say one of the most challenging things that will come from these 4 weeks we spend together will be those of us in this room are going to feel called on to use our phones less. And somebody's going to get on my face about my backgammon addiction. I don't know if anybody shares my backgammon addiction, but when I have a spare moment and I just want to escape, I escape into my phone playing backgammon. At least it sounds like a more intelligent kind of thing to do, play backgammon on your phone. But I think I probably need to play less, put my phone down, and go run outside. Not run, but go outside and do something outside. I can't run. The challenge of collective action, and this is a good reason why we're glad that this many people are coming together, because it's going to take a Bible class full of people, a small group full of people, especially those of you raising kids right now. It's going to take collective action and some agreement so that your child isn't the only one saying, well, I'm the only one, I'm 13, I'm the only one that doesn't have an Instagram account. It's going to help if we can get behind some collective action in pockets of people so that she's not the only one, he's not the only one that doesn't have an Instagram account.
All right, so if you've read the book or if you haven't, I think this is a really apt analogy that he opens with. He talks about sending your kid to Mars, and he sets up this whole idea that if you were told by some billionaire, we probably actually have this possibility on the horizon. But if you were to be told by some billionaire, hey, I'm going to take your kid to Mars, and you're saying, when will they be back? Well, I don't know if they're going to be back, right? Well, I don't know. Well, will it change who they are? Well, I don't know. Maybe. I don't know. Who can say? Would you send your kid to Mars, not knowing what the risks were and with no guarantee that they will come home? And I think that's a really interesting analogy to consider. So in what ways have we, sent our kids to Mars? And Jeff and I were talking about this morning in the car. And also, a child raised on Mars is going to have a really different experience of the world, right? And is going to have a hard time knowing how to actually live on Earth. And is there a sense, Haidt suggests, that we have done this? We've sent our children to Mars without us even knowing where we're sending them. So Haidt claims that tech companies are behaving in the same way that alcohol and tobacco companies once, and in many ways still do. I know vaping companies are very much doing this now.
And doing it knowingly. Now, this is not something we're going to spend a lot of time on. Just write those companies and you tell them what we're not going to go up against the whole industry that's selling Instagram to kids. We're not going to be able to challenge it that way. We're going to need to challenge it from within through that collective action thing. But it's not as if people who are trying to promote Instagram and Snapchat, and I'm going to show how old I am just when I don't name the newest thing. What's the newest thing? What are kids
I'm
lured
too
into?
old to know the newest thing.
You're too old?
Never ending. Yeah.
What's the newest thing out there?
Snapchat is not even the newest anymore. What's the newest, guys? TikTok. Okay. TikTok may be the worst of them all.
What did you say?
Blue Sky.
Blue Sky?
Blue Sky.
Isn't that
It's
an
the
airline?
new Twitter. It's the new.
What is Blue Sky is what?
Blue Sky is the new X alternative.
You're kidding.
Where have you been?
I don't know, but I haven't heard of Blue Sky until this very minute. How many of you had already heard of Blue Sky? Oh, come on. Well, I was reading books about ancient things, apparently.
He's so much better than the rest of us.
Oh, yeah. Well, they're doing this knowingly. They impose no enforceable minimum age limit. There is some talk about how they might be able to enforce it now, but you get on this account you're setting up. Do you have to set up a TikTok account to get to TikTok or YouTube?
I don't know. Do you have to do that? Do you have to set up a TikTok account?
We should be more informed before we teach this class. But anyway, typically you don't have to. You just have to say, I am 18 years old or older. I'm 16 or older. Yes or no. And there's no way to verify your age, so you have very young people who are getting access to accounts like this that have this addictive quality about them. And all of us who have a cell phone, which is, I'm assuming all of us who have a smartphone, we can appreciate how addictive these things are. If you start scrolling something, I heard a new phrase 2 weeks ago in one of our classes. They called it doom scrolling. I never heard of doom scrolling. I just learned of Blue Sky. Blue Sky or Blue Skies? Blue Sky?
Sky.
Blue Sky. I never heard of doom scrolling until 2 weeks ago, but doom scrolling, where you're scrolling through Instagram and you're just scrolling till you land on the next interesting thing that catches your attention enough. They call it doom scrolling for a reason. Because it's like, what are you looking for? Something doom and gloom or what? I don't actually know why they call it doom scrolling. Anyway, no enforceable age limit, and they ignore the evidence that's emerging that they're marketing so forcefully, even though it's causing damage to teenagers. It's not just causing damage to teenagers, it's causing damage to all of us, we would say. This is what we'll talk about more next week, but this whole shift from play-based childhood to phone-based childhood is a thing. It's a big thing, particularly the impact on Gen Z. Do you know what generation you're in? Thought we might have to pause here and figure out. Anybody here from the greatest generation? Born from 1901 to 1927. I was assuming we don't have many, if any, from the greatest generation. I thought the greatest generation was the World War II generation, but it's the ones who led through World War II, so their last birth year was 1927. Then there's the silent generation from 1928 to 1945 or so. How many of you are members of the silent generation? Did you know you were the silent generation? Because you just endured. You just took it. It was wartime. Things were hard. You may remember rationing, gas rationing, or other kinds of rationing. You may remember your mom going to work in a munitions plant or something like that. It was the silent generation, followed by, of course, what I thought was the greatest generation, 1946 to 1964 birth years, the boomer generation, as in, thanks, boomer, which obviously I'm one. I was born in 1959 on November the 24th. So how many boomers are in the room? Okay, that's a lot of us. Followed by what comes after that one?
Gen X.
Gen X. Followed by Gen X, born from 1965 to 1980. How many of you are in Gen X? Raise your hand, Jeff. Yeah, I see Jeff over there. Raise his hand. And then millennials, 1981, 1995, 96. So we were just talking about...
There's a big generational divide.
A big generational. 1980, 1982. So they talk about an intergenerational marriage. All the consequences of that. Then followed by, is that?
Gen Z.
Gen
we
Z,
have Gen Z.
1995 to 2010. So you're the Gen Zs out there. And then followed by, that's a good question. We call it Alpha, but we'll talk about Alpha in a minute. He also says that this next generation, the Alpha generation is supposed to be called, may not have started yet. 14-year delay because of smartphone usage. They may be stuck in Gen Z. What defines a generation, they say, how significant is it? I'm not sure. It is that here's a generation that shares circumstances to the point where they have a common affinity with each other and their unique features. The baby boomer generation was actually the first one to be officially named by the U.S. Census Bureau. So thanks, boomers. But now this is becoming more commonplace to identify generations in this way.
So as Dad's saying that they generations are, how did you say it? You said it really well. It's based on common shared experience, right? And so he talks about how in Gen Z, they hit puberty by the time that iPhones were being so widely distributed, which is really hard for me to imagine as a millennial having that when I had my first flip phone at 19 years old that I bought myself. And then the front-facing cameras were also, which we don't think of, that seems like a small shift, but the book talks about what a giant shift that was for Gen Z. And all of this that we're talking about leads to kind of his central thesis, which was that we have greatly overprotected our kids in the physical real world, all while dramatically underprotecting them online. And that kind of dynamic has caused great harm. And so then he moves on to talk about, and we're going to pause here to discuss, and we'd love to hear what you think. I thought this was an incredible way of describing, in his words, what is the difference between the real world and the virtual world. So in the real world, we have embodied experiences, right? We use our bodies to communicate. We're looking at each other's faces and our facial expressions and the way that our bodies move. We learn to read body language. They are synchronous, so happening at the same time. So we're learning the actual back and forth. I use something called Voxer. Have you guys ever heard of Voxer? It's like a voice memo app.
Wait, raise your hand if you've heard of Voxer. Okay.
It's kind of an old person app, but I use it a lot to talk to my friends. And just recently, I was talking to my friend on the actual phone, which I feel like never happens. And she said something and I was quiet and I was like, did my Vox go off? And I realized I'm actually talking to her on the phone. I'm used to just hearing her voice messages and waiting. So I'm so used to myself that asynchronous communication, one-to-one and one to several, and only one conversation going at a time. So I'm either talking to you, my friend, or I'm talking to a few of you like we're doing now, but I'm only having one conversation at a time. And this one I think is my favorite and maybe the most important. There is a high bar for entry and exit. We invest and we are motivated to repair rifts. So in order for us to be in a relationship, there's a high bar for that. There's something expected of me. Like I have to talk back. If you're going to ask me a question, I ask you a question, right? And if I want to just leave the conversation, there is like an expectation that I say, okay, thanks, bye, right? Or if you say something I don't like, it's more simple than just, all right, I'm just going to stop talking to you and walk away, right? There's a high bar for exit.
So in the virtual world, then our communication with each other is disembodied. There are people who are more comfortable sending text messages to each other than they are having an actual conversation.
And if I can pause here and say, I see this in our school cafeteria. I see kids who are sitting at the table together with their friends and they're texting each other. Like literally sitting next to their friends, but they're more comfortable texting each other than speaking to each other.
Why would that be? I mean, I know they've been habituated to texting, but are they texting things they don't want their other friends around the table to hear?
That can be part of it, but certainly not all of it.
You know what it's like to sit in a restaurant. There are those 4 people at the restaurant and all of them on their phones. None of them talking to each other. I have students who have policies where they go out to a restaurant, they say, all right, and they just stack all the phones where the ketchup is and talk to each other, which I think is a great discipline. I'm watching some of my students practice, but communication that's disembodied means here's one more way in which we're not practicing intimacy. We're not practicing how to talk to each other in an embodied way. We're not skilled at learning or reading body language anymore. And as a very famous nonverbal communication specialist whose name was Bird Whistle, I just love saying that. A guy's name was Bird Whistle, and he was an expert in nonverbal communication. He used to say that in North America, 70% of all communication is nonverbal. In North America, 70%. Which means if you cut out the 70%, the nonverbal stuff, and you just make it a text or something, some post. I don't know. I don't do Instagram, so I don't know. Is that a post? Do you post to Instagram?
Sure, yes. You can do a lot of
anyway,
things.
You can imagine what you're losing when you go to a disembodied kind of communication. You're missing out on some really important clues. I mean, I think about being a married person for a long time, what it was like when I would want to say to Beth, I didn't actually say that. If we played back the transcript, my words were, but it doesn't matter what my words were. It matters more how I said those words and what the look in my eye was, what was my tone of voice. And of course, I know that now. But what about a whole generation that's not very skilled? I hate to write off a whole generation, but there's a generation of us that aren't very skilled at embodied communication or synchronous communication. So the asynchronicity of it, meaning you take it out of its context, take out all the other clues that are going on. How do we talk in a noisy room? How do we talk when there are other people around? Can we just look at each other and focus, or am I going to be constantly looking around you? I mean, if I'm not practiced at that, then because my communication has been shaped so much by communicating on a smartphone, that's going to be problematic. One-to-many, broadcasting to large audiences, multiple conversations at once. I mean, in the old days of Facebook, when people would say, I've got 1,000 Facebook friends, and somebody like me would say, really? Are they really your friends? You must have a really low definition for what a friend is. If you have 1,000 friends, who has 1,000 friends, unless there are 7 on the Enneagram? That's a different book. A low bar for entry and exit, like Rachel said. This one seems really huge. This relationship isn't going well. You can just block them. Conflict? Just block them, unfriend them. And when you are posting something, it's, let's say, something political in a previous political season, and then everybody else agrees with you, everybody likes that, just communicating in the famous, now infamous, echo chamber of like-minded people, rather than learning to have real discourse that's not mean-spirited, but genuine, and there's a back and forth. Communication is a dance, and you just don't get very good at this kind of dance if your communication is all virtual. Relationships are often short-lived and or disposable. Bing, I'm a friend, and we're done with that one. We'll go on to the people that are easy to form friendships with. Real problem here.
So not to totally disregard that there is a whole way to be passive aggressive online, right? Not to say that we can't use nonverbals, because you can leave someone on red to send a message, right? Or you can like the comment instead of hearting it, and that definitely sends a message, right? A passive aggressive message, just, to put that out there. But I do think this list is super valuable for us to think about. And what I wanted to ask, so again, it's easy to pick on Gen Z, but I'm looking at this list going, yes, this has happened to me. Like, I can see the ways that my own media use has caused some of this disintegration in my own ability to communicate well. So I would like to ask Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, anyone who wants to share, what of this list resonates to you, and what are some things that you notice in your own life about the ways that your social communication skills have disintegrated? I would love to hear.
And we have people with microphones. You can come up your aisle. If you have a comment, just chime in.
I am counseled all the time because I want to talk to people on my cell phone, but the new way of dealing with each other is to text. And sometimes my texts aren't clear and it sounds maybe sarcastic or something. So what is the appropriate answer to that?
Rachel?
I don't know. I have no idea. I'm not a very good texter either, and so that's why I prefer Voxer. But I think that's a hard thing when you're not a texter, and that's what everyone does, right? So I don't know.
I love texting because it's so efficient. I love things that are efficient. 3 sentences, boom, done. But I also like people.
Working at the high school, I'm loving that they took the phones away more this year, because some kid could be really, really happy, next second get a text, and there's a fight in the hallway 2 seconds later, as an example. But I'm seeing kids getting along more this year, communicating more, and less, maybe I'm imagining it, but it seems like less fighting, because it's so easy not to check out the rumors and stuff and just like, oh, well, they said this, blah, blah, blah. Where now they're talking things out more.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi. As someone who has been engrossed in the opposite end of the education ladder, we're having babies and toddlers and small children of Gen Z parents coming to us who have zero conflict resolution, zero ability to sustain through an uncomfortable situation because they don't have that pacifier in their hand that their parents have used. Yeah. And so the high bar, low bar thing just really struck me because it's something that we've been seeing even in the tiny ones.
Wow. That's pretty frightening. Okay.
I'm a residential appraiser, and I spend my time now training new guys, and they're younger, coming out of college. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking about one young man I'm working with that has a terrible time now that he has a license going and talking to banks about getting on their panel, becoming an appraiser for the bank. He doesn't know how to talk to anybody. He's struggling finding a church because being in crowds and being able to talk to people in crowds is almost impossible for him. He's difficult. Even as small as a Bible class, he's got one, maybe two friends that he can talk to. But I'm seeing it in this generation coming in to my profession.
Yeah, interesting. Comment over here.
So what's unique about both lists is that he makes a point, the author, that the real world list has been around for millions of years because that's what we've always known. Yeah. Whereas the virtual world has been around for a few decades. Yeah. And so this idea of going back into, we're leaning into what we don't know, but also to point previous is that this newer generation, they don't have the language skills because they haven't had to develop them because of online learning environments to where I can just say I'm out and I don't have to figure out how to say, so there's no practice. And there hasn't been in all the practice forums to figure out how to do conversation, conflict resolution are online, which is almost counterproductive.
Yeah, that's right. One more comment? Yes, sir.
To stay with your theme around the cross-generational nature of this, those of us whose jobs are part of the global economy, those of us who are involved with remote work probably experience a lot of these. And it requires intentionality to interact with others in those contexts in a way that still builds good communication and good relationship.
Yeah, boy, it does. And I probably have bosses in here, but during the COVID generation where we did so much online, if I'm in a Zoom meeting and I mute my video feed, I mute my camera so I can actually do other emails while I'm sort of listening into the meeting. Anybody ever confess doing that? Multitasking? Yeah, and I see a few willing to confess. Well, we could linger there a little longer, but...
Well, I was going to say, I mean, like I said at the beginning, I don't want us picking on this new generation because, raise your hand if you've noticed a change in your own attention span, for example. All right. And
what did you say?
That's good, Dad.
Yeah.
But even myself, if I'm sitting it's very hard for me to just sit and watch a show, right? I used to be able to sit and watch a movie, no problem, right? But I can tell even in the last couple of decades, it's been harder and harder for me to just pay attention to one thing. And I think, all of these things impact me too. And my prefrontal cortex was formed when I got my first smartphone, which gives me a lot of compassion for what we're seeing. Yeah. Okay. So, upfront. He's very upfront, Haidt, in his book, where he proposes what he wants to see. And the first thing he says, so no smartphones before high school. He said no child should have a smartphone before the age of 14 at all.
No social media before age 16.
Okay, and phone-free schools is kind of his big refrain.
And then far more unsupervised play and childhood independence, again, the topic of next week. Those four things. Right at the beginning of the book, he says, here's what I'm going to propose. And then he defends those proposals later on. Just curious, Do you have a gut reaction to any of that? Do you think, yeah, that makes sense? There's one thumbs up. Anybody want to comment on that? There's a comment back there.
I identify as a Gen Z, but my dad made me have a flip phone all through high school, and it's probably one of the best things that he ever made me do. So
flip phone all through high school. Wow.
Yes, I got my
Did you feel humiliated? Did you feel embarrassed?
No, I felt super cool.
Yeah.
But I didn't get my first smartphone until I actually went to Honor Symposium at Harding. And that was like my first experience having a smartphone was there. So it was just a super big, like, different thing. Because all my friends had them, and I was like, Dad, I need a smartphone. He's like, nah, flip phone. So he's like, when you go to college, you can get a smartphone. So he kind of went a little extreme, but I'm really grateful that he did.
That's great, Dad. I like him too. Let's comment over there.
Basically, I kind of had a similar situation. In middle school, I was required to have a phone because I had to walk far to my bus stop or whatever. My mom wanted to make sure I got there safe. But I know the big thing now is like Life 360 or like Apple tracking for your kids and stuff. And like you have to have a smartphone to have any of those apps. So now I know a lot of parents would probably be hesitant to not letting their kids have a smartphone because they feel safer knowing where their kids are. But to me, it was definitely helpful not having a smartphone in middle school.
Yeah.
But I know a lot of parents are probably going to have a hard time with that.
Life 360 is going to be another interesting thing we can talk about in subsequent weeks as well. Let's go over here for a comment.
I know the phone-free schools is definitely catching some strength as a movement. There was legislation passed across several states to make that a reality. I know I received a survey as a parent of kids in Searcy Public Schools asking about my feelings with regard to phones in schools, and I think it was Jonathan Haidt that I saw on an interview talking about, as an educator, to try and compete with a device, like there would never been a time in the past where a child could bring in a movie to watch while the teacher's giving instruction, or their record player, or Discman, or whatever it was, whatever the current technology of the day is, where it's actually with them on their person while a teacher is giving instruction. It's an impossible ask, I think, for our educators to try and compete with that.
Well, I actually meant to mention this at the beginning about how we can blame Gen Z for this all we want, but really we have some responsibility here. And one of the things I was going to mention is BB School District sent out a similar survey. And I want to say 99% of the teachers and administrators said, get them out. Do not bring them on campus at all. Get them a locked pouch, whatever it takes, right? And it was almost the exact reverse of parents. All of them, almost all, was it 80%, Jeff, who acknowledged they were a problem, but then 80% said, but no, my kid needs their phone for safety reasons, right? And so that's one of the reasons that there's a disconnect happening here, because these are parents from multiple generations saying with this fallacy of safetyism, right, which we'll talk about in the future. But that is definitely a problem, as there's a disconnect happening.
I hear so many people say, what about a school shooting?
Yes. So actually, this is one I hear a lot. What happens if there's a school shooting? And what the police would say, and all of us in the building would say, that's the worst possible time for every child to have their own device. Can you imagine the chaos of all these parents trying to come up? I mean, it's insanity. And for somehow we've bought into this logical fallacy.
This is exactly what I was about to say, is that I had a child in Searcy schools where there was a rumor that took hold of the entire school because it spread through cell phones, of course. And then half the school got checked out. And I did not check out my child because I thought, if this was a real thing, I would have heard about this from administrators, from the Searcy Police Department. But this was a complete disruption to the school day and a loss of an education day because of cell phones. I was also going to say, I think part of the reason this is so hard, like I'm trying my very best to do exactly what's on this screen, but it is costing me personally. If parents are going to actually do this, it's going to make our lives significantly harder and less convenient. And we're going to have to be even more comfortable with our kids being angry with us and with our kids like feeling weird. And there are ways that I think I felt weird as a kid, and maybe ways that my parents asked me to be different that were challenging. But what I want to remember and try to stoke compassion for in myself is that it's much harder for our children now than it was for me. And the ways I was being asked to be different were not nearly as socially costly as what I'm asking of my daughter.
We have the data to prove it, too. Let's hear one more comment because we need to move on. One more, back there.
Brenda and I have been in education for 30 plus years, and number 1 through 4 are all critically important, but number 4 is the one, especially in younger childhood, is so critically important. Mm-hmm. These kids need to learn to play. And I remember as a kid, we had more interest in the box than we did the toy that came in it. And we've got to allow our children to learn what it means to get along and to learn how to share and to learn, but all of those skills are learned through free play. And they're not going to get it through screen time, watching videos and watching all this other stuff. And but that's easier for parents because it occupies them. But they've got to learn to turn it off and send them outside and let them play. And I understand the safety reasons that started all of that, child being, stolen or whatever. But there is something so important about just being able to be creative and learn to get along and all of those basic fundamental human reactions and learning to get, learning how other people react to you and what you do, and then learning to figure that out and just being able to socially manage their own emotions.
That's so true. And we had lots of stories about that. Let's.
Can I just make one comment and say, I think we're talking about how we can't know other people well in this way. We also can't know ourselves because there's a feedback loop that we get from interacting with real human beings that teaches us, that they don't respond well when I say it that way. I guess I better change how I'm doing it. We need that feedback loop to become familiar with ourselves.
That's right.
So we are going to be able to we are going to have a lot more time to address exactly what you're talking about, the need for free play and all of those things which are vital. And then also the need for collective action, like Sarah was saying. Haidt is very compassionate in his book towards exactly what Sarah described, of how almost impossible this is when you're by yourself and how it takes a group of people to decide. So this next section, he talks about the great rewiring of childhood is what he addresses next, where he talks about the pain and suffering we're seeing in our students. And then he talks first about what parents are saying. And I would wonder what would resonate with you, either as a child, if you're part of a wired generation, or as a parent. Constant conflict. I know I have a stepson who really loves screens, and we feel like this is a constant conflict in our house. So we feel like we lay down rules and enforce limits, but there's so many devices or so many ways to have a device. Even they have Chromebooks at school all day. They're on a device at school even. So maintaining family rituals and basic connections can feel like it's like an ever-resisting tide. I certainly resonate with that.
So this is Jonathan Haidt asking parents, what's your experience with your children and cell phones? And some of them say it's constant conflict. Some of them say there's something unnatural going on. I don't know what makes this unnatural, and that's why the book is so important and resonates so well with people who, like us, who have been there and done that, raised children, that children are missing out on something and parents are trying to figure out what is it we're missing out on. And back to that safetyism thing, which we'll talk about next time. When you get an Amber Alert, how do you get the Amber Alert? On your phone. No matter what's going on, you're going to get an Amber Alert. Oh, somebody in another county somewhere is missing. It gives this sensation that kidnappings are happening all the time. So who would I be if I let my child walk from Harding Drive to off junior high? Or to Sidney Diener? I would be an irresponsible parent. I might get reported to DHS for neglect. If they walk, how many of you grew up walking? This is going to be one of those, we walk to school 20 miles and snow both ways, right? How many of you walk to school? We walk to school. Just different. That's a kind of free play, but we weren't as nervous about child kidnappings as we are now, and other sorts of safety concerns. There are some parents who say, I feel like I've lost my child. I've just lost my child. And if I try to rein it in, try to put these rules on screen time, phone time. They have to turn their phone in. We all charge them together in the kitchen. I feel like she's going to feel so socially isolated, or he'll feel so socially isolated. In the book, Jonathan Haidt makes the case that social death to teenagers is actually worse than actual death. They're more afraid of social death, that is, losing our friends, than they are of actual physical death. But regardless of the severity of the problem, he says, as parents experience it, most parents don't want their children to have a phone-based childhood. We know this is not right, so how do we move beyond it? Well, we're not getting to the solution just yet.
Okay, so what does the data say? He and his team did a lot of data gathering in this book. And I love this quote that he also includes, the great irony of social media. The more you immerse yourself in it, the more lonely and depressed you become. I think all of us, regardless of generation, can sense how that can happen, even if we are not raised by it.
Go to the website and see some of these. The website is anxiousgeneration.com, right? Mm-hmm. You can go there yourself and see all these charts. We just chose a few of them. Look at the spike around 2012 in anxiety according to age groups. This jump from between ages 18 to 25. By the way, in case you're wondering how he defines anxiety, there's fear, which is an emotional response to some real or perceived threat, an imminent threat. And then there's anxiety, which is an emotional response to an imagined future threat. Not a real one, an imagined future threat. It's anxiety. Look at that tremendous spike, especially between people ages 18 to 25, starting in 2012. And then the generation, the 26 to 34. And then you can see the older we get, the less effective we've been since 2008 when they started collecting this data up until 2022. Is it because of the prevalence of cell phone usage? Next slide. The percent of undergraduates with a mental illness, and he names the mental illnesses there: anxiety, actual cases of anxiety, depression, ADHD, and then other things, but have spiked by these huge percentages. Since 2010, a 134% increase in self-reported cases of anxiety. Tremendous increase, 106% increase in the incidence of depression. And those of us who are working with college students, we see this so much. Probably have some here who work in our counseling center on the third floor of the McIntyre, and they could report the same thing. Tremendous spike. And due to what? What changed in 2010 that increased these numbers so much?
All right, so we see a lot of similar trends with major depressive episodes. So note the 145% increase for girls, 161% for boys. The suicide rates for boys and girls have also increased. They show those charts as well. And then emergency department visits, so going to the ER for self-harm incidents. Notice the increase there. It's shocking. And I will say, as a high school counselor, this has just become a regular part of life. We've had multiple, unfortunately, suicides in the past few years, along with self-harm incidents are so high. And I do want to pause and mention this is an interesting point. So I'm a college and career counselor, so I'm bringing in recruiters from colleges, but also like the military. And all of my military recruiters the last few years has said it's become almost impossible to find qualified students for two reasons, right? This is pretty amazing. For one, in order to go into the military, you have to have had no hospitalizations or no mental health disorders that you are medicated for. That eliminates, to be honest, almost everyone right there. The vast majority of our students are on some kind of anxiety or depressive medication or some kind of ADD medication, something like that. And then they say, if you can find, once in a while, we'll find this one great candidate, a kid who has not been hospitalized, they're not taking any kind of medication, and it's this, oh man, this could be a great thing for this kid. And then you find out, not kidding, they go to what's called MEPS, where they do their final qualification. The child and the parents find out they can't have their cell phones at boot camp, and they withdraw themselves. This is the problem that our military recruiters are seeing, and the reason we're having so what they've done is they've lowered ASVAB score requirements to try and get even more people. So this is a problem we're seeing, this is literally a national security issue at this point.
Wow. Talk about the cell phone connection here. According to Pew Research in 2011, 77% of U.S. teens had a cell phone, but only 23% of them had a smartphone. Most teens could only access social media, the internet, by that family computer that was in some prominent place in your den or on your dining room table, right? I'm trying to remember what ours was. Wasn't a Commodore 64, that was long ago, right? Did we have a computer, a family computer?
I have no idea. You did get us randomly a Super Nintendo once, and I think we only had it for not very long because we fought all the time.
It was
over
a great failing on my part, a parental failing on my part. Yeah. Well, by 2016, 79% of teens had a smartphone. So did 28% of children between ages 8 and 12. Now we're getting into daycare territory. So in 2015, Pew Research reported that 1 out of 4 teens said they're on their phones almost constantly. Almost constantly. That was in 2015.
And then in 2022, that number is nearly doubled to 46%. And then we see in 2010, the iPhone introduces the self-facing camera and filters are born. And we can all see, I think, the degree to which that's changed our culture. In this quote from the MIT professor that we are forever elsewhere. I feel that for sure in my own life. I feel my attention divided in ways it's never been.
Forever elsewhere.
Ever elsewhere.
And you wonder why they're not looking you in the eye, or if they're looking you in the eye, they have this glazed over look in their eye. They're just not really paying attention. So what about other factors? You're thinking, okay, 2010, surely terrible things have been happening since 2010. Not just this. I mean, this is they lived through COVID, so surely COVID is a factor here. And Haidt addresses that. You could talk about 9/11. You could talk about the financial crisis, the housing crisis of 2008, which dropped the birth rate for a period, which is why we're talking about the enrollment cliff at Harding in 2025. We're not just talking about it at Harding, we're talking about it across the board. There will be fewer high school graduates in May of 25, June of 25, than there were going back to the housing crisis of 2008. So that's a deal. But are these the other reasons why there's this mental health crisis among us? And he would say, nope, because it got so dramatically worse in 2010, but the world didn't necessarily get worse in 2010. We haven't had major calamities except for COVID, and it's not just in the U.S. He calls it the Anglosphere. Haidt has done, and his team have done good research in Britain, in Nordic countries, which isn't part of the Anglosphere, but he calls it that anyway, in Australia, and everywhere where there's this prevalence of cell phone usage among teenagers or smartphones, the same thing is showing true. Higher incidence of anxiety and depression, dramatically increased rates of teen suicide, and so on.
And just to pause and say, I think one of the things Jeff and I were talking about that we've noticed in the last few years as educators is like, what's something else that creates depression and anxiety or exacerbates those symptoms is exhaustion. And our kids are exhausted at school because they're in bed scrolling through their phones at 2 till 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. It's very common for the vast majority of our students to be doing that. And so that only heightens all of these other things that we see.
That's where we're going next week. Say something about that, Rachel.
So the play base, I think the comment back here was so good. And so Haidt talks a lot about this, again, dual relationship, how we have not protected kids online, which we've talked about some today, and we'll talk about more. But then at the same time, we're not allowing them to experience the real world, to face natural consequences of their actions, to play without us watching. I think about currently, we're living in an Airbnb due to a house issue, and we have this little neighborhood with a ton of kids. And I think about how rare it is anymore to see a bunch of kids just outside free playing with each other. And I know the other day I got the doorbell rang, and it was a little, and I was like, who is this? Because I don't really live in this neighborhood. And it was a little kid with a dog, and he said, is this dog yours? And I was like, no, and I'm so sorry. And then this other kid ran up and was helping. And then by probably the next 2 hours, there was like an army of maybe 30 children walking through the neighborhood with these dogs, ringing on doorbells, is this dog yours? And
That's
trying
great.
to find, and I just was watching that thinking, how many skills are they learning by working together to solve this problem? And how rare it is that we see that, because how many parents are too afraid to let their children play when they're not around to watch?
One of the remarkable statistics in the book to me is about the dramatic decrease in ER visits among children and teenagers for injuries like broken arms, broken ankles. That is, injuries you get when you jump out of a tree. Far fewer of those kinds of things reported in ERs around the world. I wonder why that's true. Could this be a product of the safetyism we're talking about? How do we frame all this? I mean, Jonathan Haidt's not in a position to frame this for us as Christ followers. I think the Apostle Paul is. I mean, you read a book and the title is The Anxious Generation. Of course, I go straight to Paul and think about, don't be anxious about anything. You know, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I'll say rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Don't be anxious about anything, but in everything with prayer and petition, present and thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. And the peace of God, the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. It's the next line that I think is most relevant here. So, what do you think about? What do you dwell on? What are you fixated on? It's so easy to be fixated on this, stupid little backgammon game, just because it's kind of an escape and it's harmless. It seems harmless enough. What are you fixated on? Paul would say, following that paragraph, so think about these things, whatever is true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy. Think about such things. Dwell on those things. To what extent does my obsession with my phone help me fix my mind on things that are true and noble and right and pure and lovely and admirable and excellent and praiseworthy? Well, if you're listening to Beth's app, Lectio 365, maybe. I mean, that could be really helpful. There are good apps out there. But if you're playing backgammon too much, probably not. Well, let's ask God's blessing on it, shall we? That this will be a week where we can fix our eyes on Him and fix our minds on such things. Let's pray. Lord, thank you for a chance to gather like this as a church family and talk about something really important that's affecting all of us, not just teenagers, our kids. It's affecting the world in dramatic ways. Pray that you help us to have the courage to take the kinds of collective action that Jonathan Haidt prescribes, to do that in little pockets, from small groups to Bible classes to little clusters of families who are here together trying to raise children in the body of Christ. I pray, Father, that those of us who are adults, that we'll be better role models for our kids of lives that aren't so tethered to these devices of ours. And we pray you'll bless this gathering as we talk about this important issue. And we do pray that this will be a week where we can think about those things that fit all those categories that are true and noble and right and so forth. Help us, oh God, we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Thank you for coming.